My name is Hillary Weaver. I'm 34, and my job is making sure newborn babies keep breathing. This past February, around my mother's dinner table, my family announced my brother's fifth child. Then they announced what they'd decided to do with the rest of my existence. My mother said I didn't have a real life anyway. She was grinning when she said it. Everyone kept right on eating. Handing the bread around like my entire future was just another side dish someone had already portioned out. Not a single one of them knew about the folder saved on my phone. 3 weeks from rewriting everything, and what my mother did after I showed them, after the whole room went dead silent, that's the part that still echoes when I'm lying awake at night. Because the phone wasn't the finale, it was only the spark. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet women finally say the things families pretend they can't hear. If you've ever been the person everybody leans on and nobody truly sees, this one belongs to you. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, and make sure you subscribe, because the ending of this story is worth sticking around for. Now, let me take you back to a Sunday roughly 3 months before that dinner, so you can understand exactly what my family believed I was for. A Sunday at my parents' place in the suburbs of Columbus always followed a script. I'd make the 15-minute drive from my apartment in Westerville with a casserole dish riding shotgun because Mom had phoned Thursday and said, "You'll bring the potatoes. Nobody makes them like you." I'd stand at the sink peeling while my sister-in-law Kayla took a nap on the couch. I'd set the table. I'd swap the dead battery in the doorbell because Dad had mentioned it twice without actually looking at me, which in Weaver shorthand is basically a work order. I'd keep one eye on Sam, who was 4, and one eye on Nora, who was 2. While their parents scrolled their phones, and my mother gave Aunt Ruth the complete rundown of my brother Danny's latest promotion at the building supply warehouse. Danny got a toast raised in his honor. Kayla got sympathy for how tired she looked. I got asked if I'd gotten around to looking at that leaky faucet yet. I want to be fair here, I wasn't sulking in some corner. I laughed at the jokes. I sliced the pie. I loved those kids so fiercely it sometimes embarrassed me. But somewhere between the dishes and the diaper I ended up changing, I understood my role the way you understand weather. You don't negotiate with it. You just dress for it. I was the appliance of that household. Dependable, plugged in, never consulted. That particular Sunday, we were clearing plates when Mom glanced around and asked if anybody had spotted the gravy boat lid, and 4 adults swiveled toward me simultaneously. Like I was the household lost and found desk. It was almost funny. Then everyone grabbed their coats, and my mother boxed up leftovers for Danny's family, for Ruth, for the neighbor next door. There was no container set aside for me. Nobody had noticed that I never actually sat down to eat. I noticed that they didn't notice. I always noticed. If you want to understand how I landed that role, you have to meet my grandmother, June. When I was 27, her heart began to fail, slow and cruel, and the family convened a meeting at my parents' kitchen table that lasted all of 11 minutes. Danny had 2 babies and a mortgage. Mom said her back was bad. Dad said whatever Mom said. Then every face pivoted to me with the same warm, awful certainty. And my mother delivered the sentence that would run my life for the next 4 years. "You're the nurse." So I became the nurse. 4 years of evenings and weekends at Grandma, June's small house on Maple Court. Pill organizers, sponge baths, 2 ambulance rides at 3 in the morning. One Christmas Eve spent in an ER corridor, holding her hand, while my family texted to ask whether I could still handle the ham. I was pulling full shifts in the neonatal intensive care unit, and then driving to Maple Court to work a second unpaid one. Mom managed what she called logistics, which translated to phone calls, which translated to instructions, which translated to me. Grandma June passed 3 years ago at 89, her hand in mine. At the funeral, the pastor rose and praised my mother's devotion to family caregiving, and my mother dabbed her eyes and accepted the praise. I stood in the second row wearing the good shoes Grandma June had bought me, and I absorbed something about how credit circulates in my family. It travels upward, always upward. Here's what I'll share for now because it matters later. Grandma June left me something. Not money, the little she had went into house repairs years before, something else entirely. I'll get there. I promise, because it's the reason that folder existed on my phone at all. After June passed, the family found me a new assignment without ever advertising it. Danny and Kayla lived 10 minutes from me with 4 kids and a schedule held together with string and prayers. I became the string. Fever at midnight, call Aunt Hilly, she's a nurse. Kayla stuck at the dentist. Aunt Hilly can grab Mason from practice. Anniversary weekend. Aunt Hilly will take all 4, she's so wonderful with them. And here's the complicated part, the part that kept the whole apparatus functioning. I genuinely, deeply loved those children. Mason 9, who provided live commentary on his own video games like a sports broadcaster. Sam 4, who hugged you with a full running start. Nora 2, a tiny blonde wrecking ball. And Ellie. Ellie was 7, and she was mine in some quiet way I can't justify biologically. She was the only person in that entire family who ever asked me questions about myself. What do you like, Aunt Hilly? What's your favorite bird? Do nurses ever get scared? I would have stepped into oncoming traffic for that child, and everybody knew it. And that was precisely the trap. Love is a wonderful rope to bind someone with, because they'll hold the knot in place for you. I had attempted boundaries. For the record, 2 years ago, I said no more overnight babysitting on weeknights because I was pulling 12-hour shifts. That resolution survived exactly until the next stomach flu. When I held the line anyway, I didn't get an argument. I got a sigh, a certain look, and my mother on the phone saying I'd become difficult, followed by 3 weeks of being lovingly frozen out with silence until I repaired things by hosting Easter. I thought I understood the math of my family by then. I thought I'd mapped every way they could spend me. I hadn't. They were about to discover an entirely new currency. Let me show you both halves of my life side by side. One Tuesday in October at 4 in the morning, I was standing over an incubator with a baby girl born at 26 weeks, 1 pound 15 ounces, a human being smaller than a bag of flour. Her oxygen dropped, and the room turned very quiet and very fast simultaneously, and for about 90 seconds, my hands and my training were the only wall between that child and the dark. We brought her back. Her father, a big man in a paper gown, sobbed into my shoulder like a boy. Her mother gripped my wrist and said, "You're an angel, do you know that? Does your family know what you do?" I smiled and said something modest. 12 hours later, I was at my parents' house because Mom needed help moving the good china before the holidays. When I finished, I mentioned I was exhausted and wanted to head home, and my mother waved a dish towel at me, breezy as a church hymn, and said, "Oh, stay and do the pots, honey. It's not like you have anything to rush home to." I stood there with my hands in cooling dishwater and did the calculation nobody else in that kitchen ever bothered with. Strangers in a hospital corridor thought I was a miracle worker. The woman who raised me thought I was a free hour with legs attached. That's the thing about being useful. And if you've lived it, you already know, useful is invisible, a lamp is useful. Nobody asks the lamp how its day went. I dried the pots. I drove home and sat in my car in the dark outside my building for a while. 3 weeks later, the family group chat detonated, and everything I'm about to share with you began. It was a Tuesday in mid-November when my phone lit up on the break room table like a slot machine hitting. The Weaver family group chat, 31 messages in 4 minutes. Pinned at the top was an ultrasound photo, gray, grainy, unmistakable. Beneath it, my brother Danny had typed, "Round 5, baby," with roughly a dozen exclamation points. Kayla followed with a hearts emoji and a post she'd copied from her own page. God said one more. Aunt Ruth sent flowers and praying hands. My father sent a thumbs up, which for Roy Weaver constitutes practically a sonnet. And I stood there in my scrubs, coffee going cold, and I felt the honest thing first, before anything else could crowd it out. Joy, I love babies. I have spent 11 years learning how to keep the tiniest ones breathing. A new niece or nephew is not a tragedy in my eyes, and Danny sounded genuinely happy, and I typed my congratulations with everything I had. I want that on the record. Whatever you think of me by the end of this story, know that I loved that baby before anyone had started measuring me for a cage. I had just slipped the phone back into my pocket when it buzzed again. Not the group chat this time, a private call. Mom, that alone was unusual. My mother communicates by summons, typically routed through whichever person happens to be standing nearest her. Her voice had a shine to it I hadn't heard in years. The sound she gets around weddings and funerals, occasions where she gets to direct traffic. "Isn't it wonderful?" she said, and before I could respond, she dropped her voice like we were accomplices. "We need to talk about the plan, sweetheart." I remember catching my own reflection in the break room window. Plan? Nobody had invited me to any meeting where a plan was on the agenda. I said, "What plan, Mom?" She laughed, light as frosting, and said we'd discuss it Sunday. Then she hung up, and I stood there with a sensation in my stomach I couldn't name yet. My body knew before my brain caught up. Sunday arrived, and I discovered what the shine in her voice was constructed from. My mother laid it out at the kitchen counter while she frosted a sheet cake, casual as a weather forecast. Kayla would be essentially bedridden by summer with a newborn and 4 kids already in the house. Daycare for that crew cost more than Danny earned in a month, she said, which was true. And I agreed, which was my first mistake, because agreement in my family functions as a signature. Then she reached the core of it. "So, we've been thinking you could go part-time at the hospital. Or step away for a while. Honestly, that's cleaner. Kids need consistency." She smoothed the frosting flat. "Family takes care of family." I set down my coffee and said it plainly, calmly, the way you'd state your name in a courtroom. "No, Mom, I have a job. I love my job. I'm not quitting to be a nanny. And here is the part I need you to grasp, because everything that follows grows out of this single moment." My mother did not argue with me. Arguing would have meant she'd heard me. She just smiled at the cake, tapped the spatula twice against the bowl, and said, "Well, we'll figure out the details later." As if I'd raised a minor concern about parking arrangements. My father wandered in, swiped a taste of frosting, and said, "Your mother's got it all worked out," with genuine admiration, the way another man might say his wife restores furniture. I drove home gripping the wheel, replaying it. I had said no, clearly in English, and it had passed through her like wind through a screen door. What frightened me wasn't that she'd ignored it. It was how relaxed she'd been. My mother is never relaxed unless she's already certain she's won. I couldn't identify where the certainty was coming from. I found out soon enough. That night, back in my apartment, I did what I'd done nearly every night for months. I opened my laptop, went to my email, and refreshed the inbox the way some people say grace, quietly, every night. Here's what nobody in my family knew. 10 months earlier, in January, I'd worked the worst shift of my career. We lost a 24-weeker at 5 in the morning, and I cried in the supply closet. Then I came home to find my mother had left me a voicemail asking me to make 3 dozen deviled eggs for a church function, since you're off Thursday. Something inside me went very still that night. Not shattered. Focused. I sat down, still wearing my coat, and completed an application I'd had bookmarked for a year and never allowed myself to finish. A neonatal resuscitation training program, attached to a hospital in Galway, Ireland. A 2-year contract teaching nurses and midwives the thing I do best in the world, keeping impossibly small people alive. I'd learned about it at a conference in Cincinnati from a silver-haired Irish doctor named Dr. Juan, who watched me run a simulation and said, "You teach with your hands. Have you thought about doing this on purpose?" I did 2 video interviews that fall on my days off, blazer on top, pajama pants below the frame. By November, I was one of the finalists. Final decisions were promised by December. The only living soul who knew was Jen, our charge nurse, my closest friend of 9 years, who kept my secret like a bank vault and checked on it in code at work. Any weather from the coast. So while my mother frosted her certainty onto a sheet cake, I had a maybe growing across an ocean. A maybe, that's all. But some nights, a maybe is the only thing standing between a woman and a basement. I refreshed the inbox one more time and went to bed. The first piece of evidence arrived 10 days later, in the middle of a shift. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. When I stepped into the hallway to answer, a pleasant voice said, "Miss Weaver, this is the front office at Beechwood Elementary. Mason's running a fever, and we couldn't reach his mom or dad." "You're listed as his emergency contact." I said. "His what?" The woman repeated it, patient as you please. "Second emergency contact, right after the parents. Kayla Weaver had listed me that fall." Nobody had asked me. Nobody had even mentioned it. You should understand it takes practically nothing to do that. A parent simply writes a name and a phone number on a form. No signature required from the person being volunteered. No permission slip for the aunt. I traded my lunch break, drove to the school, and collected a pink-cheeked Mason who felt awful and looked worse. I got him settled at his house with medicine and cartoons, because none of this was his fault. And while I was hanging his backpack on the hook by the door, a folded sheet of paper tumbled out of the front pocket. It was a printed schedule, made on a computer, with clip art suns in the corners. Across the top, in cheerful purple letters, it read, "Aunt Hilly days, Tuesdays, Thursdays, alternating weekends." My name blocked out in a calendar grid like a shift worker's schedule. Weeks and weeks of me, printed and laminated, with a magnet on the back. I stood in my brother's hallway holding it, and I felt the floor of something give way beneath me. Then I checked the date, printed small in the corner, the day the file was created. October. My mother hadn't called me about any plan until the third week of November. They had printed my life a full month before they bothered to mention it to me. The second piece of evidence found me in the cereal aisle. It was early December by then, and I was pushing a cart through the grocery store after a shift when Aunt Ruth came around the end cap and lit up like a porch light at dusk. She hugged me hard, rocked me side to side, and said right into my ear, "We are all just so proud of you." I asked what for, which was an honest question. Ruth pulled back and beamed. "Carol told everyone at church, you're taking the year off for the new baby, a full year for family." Her eyes went glassy. "You're a saint, honey. Pastor Mike said your name from the pulpit." From the pulpit. I stood there between the oatmeal and the granola bars while my aunt squeezed my hands, and I did not correct her, and I want to be honest with you about why. Because standing in that aisle, I could already hear exactly how the correction would travel. Not as Carol was mistaken. No, it would travel as Hillary backed out. That week, 2 more people stopped me. A woman from the church flower committee at the gas station, and our old neighbor at the pharmacy. Both glowing, both blessing me, both congratulating me on a decision I had never made. My mother had gone out ahead of me into every room I might ever stand in and told my story first, so I called her. I kept my voice level and said, "Mom, you can't tell people I'm quitting." "I told you no." And my mother said, warm as a heating pad, "Oh honey, I was just proud of you." Then softer, with a little laugh that contained no actual joke, "You'll see. It'll all feel natural once the baby comes." I hung up and sat very still. My mother had constructed a cage out of compliments, and she wasn't finished building. I decided to tell them about Ireland. Not the offer, which didn't exist yet, but the truth, the shape of my actual life. I rehearsed it for 3 days in the shower, in the car, at red lights. Just a simple paragraph. "I've applied for something overseas. I'm a finalist. My answer about the nanny plan is no, and it will still be no, even if Ireland says no." Friday dinner at my parents'. I arrived early. I helped with nothing on purpose, which took genuine effort. And the moment arrived, plates cleared, Dad reaching for the newspaper, Mom pouring decaf, and I actually got the first sentence out. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something about next year." My mother set down the coffee pot and looked at me, and I swear some animal part of her already sensed what was coming. And right then, Kayla called the house phone, shrieking. Sam had spiked a fever and had a seizure, a brief one, on the kitchen floor. Everything after that was coats and headlights. I was at their place in 10 minutes, because febrile seizures are terrifying and almost always harmless, and somebody in that hallway needed to be the person who knew the difference. I checked him over, talked Kayla down off the ceiling, rode along to urgent care just in case. It was midnight when we got back, Sam asleep on my shoulder, heavy as a sandbag. And in Danny's kitchen, my mother, who had driven over to manage the situation, looked around at the chaos and said to the room in the voice of a closing argument, "You see. This is exactly why the plan makes sense. Some of us have families, Hillary. Family takes care of family." She said it for the second time that month. I drove home at 1 in the morning, with my speech still folded up inside me, unspoken. Tell me something honestly in the comments. Have you ever rehearsed a sentence for days in life, just kept snatching the microphone out of your hand? Type the plan if you know that feeling, and stay with me, because what my father did next hurt worse than anything my mother had said out loud. The following Wednesday, my landlord called me. Walt owns my building and roughly half the bowling trophies in Westerville, and he bowls Tuesday nights with a league that includes, among other retired gentlemen, my father. Walt's voice was all sunshine. "Hillary, your dad mentioned you'd be moving home in the spring, helping with the new grandbaby. Wanted to talk timing on the lease, see if you'd want out early." "Awful sweet of you, hun. They don't make daughters like that anymore." I stood in my kitchen and looked at my own reflection in the dark window and heard myself say, calmly, that nothing was decided and I'd call him back. Then I drove to my parents' house. 15 minutes, most of it spent breathing on purpose. I found my father in the garage with the radio on, oiling something that didn't need oiling. I asked him quietly if he'd actually discussed ending my lease with my landlord before anyone had asked me a single question. And my dad, my sweet, conflict-proof father, rubbed the back of his neck and stared at the workbench and said, "Well, your mother said it was decided." That sentence sat between us like a dropped wrench. Not we decided, not even she decided. It was decided, whether gravity, an act of God. I looked at this man who taught me to drive, who I had watched stand up from his chair maybe twice in my entire life. And I understood that he was never going to be the one to hand me my own future back. He was just the man who painted whatever room my mother pointed at. "Dad," I said, "I'm not moving into the basement." He nodded slowly, the way you nod at a child who says she's going to be president someday. That nod did more damage than a fist ever could have. Meanwhile, the bill for all those rescues was landing on my actual career. Between the school pickup for Mason and the night of Sam's seizure, I'd swapped 2 shifts in 3 weeks. And December in a NICU is not a month with any slack in it. Jen caught me by the med cart, arms crossed. Being caught by Jen is like being caught by good weather, you don't feel it until she's serious. "Hill, you know I love you." Nursing office flagged the swaps. She lowered her voice. "The education track spot posts in the spring. You're the obvious pick. But if you keep bleeding shifts every time your family stubs a toe, somebody with worse hands and better attendance gets it." I started to explain, and she held up one hand, not unkind. "I know it's not your fault. It's never your fault, and it's always you." Then she said the sentence I've turned over in my mind 100 times since. "They're spending your career like it's their gift card." I went back to my pod and stood over an incubator and watched a 2-pound boy breathe up and down, machine steady. And I thought about gift cards, about how there's a number on them, and everyone swipes like there isn't. And one day the card just declines, and everyone acts shocked. 11 years I'd built this. Charge nurses requested me by name. Terrified parents asked for me specifically, and my family was carving it up into Tuesdays and Thursdays with clip art suns in the corners. I finished my shift, sat in my car in the parking garage, and let my forehead rest on the steering wheel for exactly 1 minute. Then my phone buzzed against the cup holder, not the group chat. Not my mother. The subject line began with the exact phrase I'd been praying toward for 10 months, offer of appointment. I didn't open it in the car. I know how that sounds, but I'd waited 10 months, and some things you don't unwrap under a parking garage light. I walked back into the hospital, badged into the NICU supply room, and stood between the shelves of preemie diapers and saline flushes, in the one place on earth where I have always known exactly who I am. Then I opened the email from Dr. Wan. "Dear Ms. Weaver, on behalf of the program, I am delighted to offer you appointment as Neonatal Resuscitation Training Specialist, Galway, a 2-year contract. A real salary listed in euros, with a relocation allowance and a settling-in stipend for the first month. The hospital would sponsor my work permit. Nurses like me are on Ireland's critical skills list, which is a fancy way of saying they need us faster than they can grow us. My registration paperwork, filed back in autumn, was already in process. Start date, March 9th, which meant flying by March 1st, which meant 12 weeks to dismantle a life and build a new one. I read it 3 times. My hands were shaking so hard the shelf of diapers blurred, and I laughed at that. 11 years of steady hands in emergency codes, trembling now like a first-year student's. I did not sign it that night. Instead, I did something I hadn't planned. I made a folder on my phone just for this. The offer letter, the contract to be signed. The airline page, with the one-way flight to Shannon already sitting in the cart. And when my thumb hovered over the box asking me to name the folder, I didn't type Ireland or Galway or New Life. I typed 4 capital letters, June. Then I stood in the supply room a while longer, listening to the vents hum. All I had to do was sign, so why were my hands still shaking? I think you already know why. It had her name on it. And I still haven't told you what she gave me. Here's what June left me. The last truly lucid night she had, about a month before the end, she sent me to her dresser for the tin where she kept buttons and dead batteries. She made me dig out a wristwatch, small face, leather band gone soft as a dollar bill, and it ran 4 minutes slow. Always had. She pressed it into my palm and folded my fingers over it with both her hands, which took her some effort by then. And she told me a story I'd never heard in 31 years. That once, long before any of us existed, she'd been accepted to an art program in Chicago. 19 years old, a portfolio full of birds she'd drawn from the kitchen window. She never went. Her mother needed her, then her brothers needed her, then a husband, then babies, then the babies' babies. I kept waiting for somebody to tell me it was my turn, she said. Her voice wasn't bitter. That was the worst part. It was just tired and certain, like a road sign. Nobody ever did, Hilly. Nobody hands a woman her turn. You take it. Then she tapped the watch with one knuckle and said she kept it slow on purpose, so every time she checked it, she'd remember. Time doesn't wait politely. I wore that watch to her funeral, 4 minutes slow, while the pastor praised my mother. I was wearing it in the supply room 3 years later the night the offer came. So that's what I did, standing between the diapers and the saline. I looked at her watch. Then I opened the folder called June, and I signed the contract with my thumb, and I bought the one-way ticket, and I put the phone in my pocket and went back to work. My hands were still shaking. I signed anyway. That's the whole secret if you want it. You don't wait for steady, you sign shaking. I intended to tell them that week. I had the offer letter printed in my purse, folded like a passport. My plan was straightforward. Sit my parents down alone, calm, adult to adult. I drove over on a Saturday in January, rehearsed and ready. And my mother met me at the door with her eyes absolutely blazing with joy, grabbed my sleeve, and said, perfect timing. Come see what your father did. She led me down the basement stairs. They had cleared it out. The treadmill that held coats, gone. Dad's fishing tubs stacked in the garage. The paneling wore a fresh coat of paint, pale yellow, and against the far wall, made up with a quilt I recognized from my childhood bedroom, stood my old twin bed, my dresser from high school. A little lamp, new curtains with flowers on them hung over the window wells. My mother stood in the middle of it with her arms out like a game show model. It'll be like having our little girl home, she said, and her voice wobbled with genuine emotion. And that's the detail I need you to sit with. It was real, she wasn't performing. My father stood on the stairs behind us, holding a paintbrush he hadn't needed for days, smiling, hopeful, proud of the yellow. They had built the cage lovingly. That's what I keep trying to explain to people. It was a loving cage with my own bed in it. I stood there with the offer letter burning a hole in my purse, and I understood, cold and clear as tap water, what would happen if I announced Ireland right here, alone. With 3 weeks' worth of phone calls, and pastors and tears available to be deployed against me before I ever reached an airport. My mother wanted an audience for my future. Fine, she'd get one, before we get to the dinner, I owe you my brother, fair and square. Late January, Danny showed up at my apartment to return a stockpot, which was a pretext because Danny returns nothing. He stood in my doorway, turning his cap around in his hands, and said, "You don't have to do this, you know, the nanny thing." And for one full second the hallway lit up. One ally. One human being inside the fence who actually saw me. I opened my mouth to tell him everything, Galway, the contract, all of it. He beat me by half a breath. "But Hill, it would really save us." "I mean it, Kayla's drowning. Daycare for the little ones is more than my paycheck." He shrugged, gesturing at my quiet apartment, my single coffee cup drying by the sink, my whole compact life. "And you're free. Free, sit with that word a minute the way I have." He meant available, he also meant costless. In my family, those had always been the same word, and he didn't even hear himself say it, which is exactly how you know a belief has finished becoming furniture. My brother is not a villain. I want that understood. He's a tired man with 4 kids and a 5th on the way, doing arithmetic in the dark. And long ago, somebody taught him that his sister was a number he could always carry the remainder to. I didn't tell him about Ireland. I just said, "I'm not free, Danny. I've never once been free." "You've just never seen the bill." He blinked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language, thanked me for the stockpot he'd brought over, and left. I closed the door and stood with my back against it. My last potential ally, and he'd folded before he ever unfolded. The summons went out the last week of January, delivered through the group chat with tulip emojis. Sunday, February 8th. A family dinner to celebrate our newest blessing and settle the arrangements. My mother writes double exclamation points the way other people load shotguns. Everyone was commanded to appear. Danny, Kayla, all 4 kids, Aunt Ruth, Uncle Gary. Mom asked me to come at 3 to do the chicken, since yours is the one everybody likes. Of course she did. I sat on my couch that night with 2 futures stretched out in front of me, and I looked at them honestly one last time. In one, a pale yellow basement and a laminated calendar of me, and everyone at church calling me a saint until the day they buried me 4 minutes slow. In the other, a folder on my phone named June, a signed contract, a one-way ticket for March 1st, 3 weeks out. 12 years of keeping other people's babies alive, traded up into teaching an entire country's nurses to do the same. I checked the watch. I checked the folder, both still ticking. Before we walk into that dining room together, you and me, I want to ask you one thing. And I'm asking seriously, have you ever been the one your family calls the free one? The sister with nothing going on. The daughter who doesn't really have anything to rush home to. The aunt whose whole life fit inside other people's emergencies. Type the word free in the comments. I want my mother's algorithm to see how many of us there are. All right, Sunday, 14 plates on the table. 2 announcements coming, the one they had planned for me and the one waiting in my coat pocket. Deep breath, let's go to dinner. But first, the week before the dinner, I burned my boats quietly, thoroughly, and in person. Monday, I called Walt myself, before my father could do any more helping, and gave notice on my apartment for the end of February. He was gracious and a little confused, since the story he'd been sold had me moving into a basement, not across the Atlantic. I let the confusion stand. Tuesday, a man with a clipboard from an international moving company walked my rooms, taped little stickers on the 4 pieces of furniture worth shipping, and quoted me a date. Wednesday, I sat in the HR office at the hospital and slid my resignation across the desk. 30 days notice by the book. Last shift, February 27th. Every box checked, because I was not going to let anyone say I left my babies short-staffed on a whim. Thursday, Jen took her break at the same time as mine, read the confirmation email over my shoulder in the stairwell, burst into tears, laughed at herself for crying. Hugged me hard enough to leave a bruise and said, "Galway has no idea what's landing on them. I want you to notice what all this means, because it's the hinge of everything." By that Sunday, there was no version of the future where I stayed. The lease was ended, the movers were booked, the notice was in. Grandma June's watch ticked 4 minutes slow on my wrist and in my head. All week, her voice kept time with it, nobody hands a woman her turn. You take it. So when I walked into my mother's dining room, I was not coming to ask permission. I was coming to deliver news. By Sunday, the only thing my family could still take from me was the goodbye. One more thing happened that week, and I've gone back and forth about sharing it, because it's the only time in this entire story I nearly lost my nerve. Thursday evening, I swung by my parents to return a roasting pan. Armor on, in and out, 90 seconds. But the kitchen was empty, and I found my mother at the dining table alone with a photo album open, and she didn't hear me come in. She was looking at a picture of a young woman in an old-style nursing student's uniform, white cap and all. It took me a moment to realize the young woman was her. You never saw these, she said, not startled, not looking up. And my mother told me in about 4 minutes, flat as a recipe, the story I had never once heard. She'd been in nursing school. She left at 24 when Danny was on the way, because that's what you did. Then her mother-in-law, June's opposite, a hard, cold woman, had her first stroke. And for 6 years, my mother washed her, fed her, turned her in bed in this very house while raising 2 kids. 6 years, she said. The day of that woman's funeral, your father's family lined up to thank the pastor for his kindness. She smoothed the plastic page with one thumb. I used to cry in the pantry so nobody had to see it. I stood there in my coat, holding a roasting pan, looking at my mother, maybe truly, for the first time. A woman the machine had eaten first, decades before she ever fed it her daughter. I almost said something. I almost put my arms around her. Then she closed the album, patted it twice, and looked up at me with perfect, sincere serenity. That's what the women in this family do, she said. You'll understand when it's your turn. And there it was. The wound hadn't taught her mercy. It had taught her that the wound was a uniform, and she was the one who did the fittings. My last shift that Friday was the kind of day that makes the whole job make sense. Baby girl G, the 26-weeker from October, 1 pound 15 ounces the night I met her, went home. 4 months of machines and setbacks, and 2 steps forward, and she left the building in a car seat that swallowed her, wearing a hat with a pom-pom bigger than her fist. Her mother stood in front of me in the corridor and tried to make a speech and couldn't. Finally, she just gripped my hand on the car seat handle and said, "You're the reason I have a daughter. I keep a small collection of sentences people have said to me the way other women keep jewelry. That one's the diamond. The unit threw me a cake in the break room. Someone had printed a banner that read Galway's gain, and under it in marker, Jen had written, Ohio's loss. Don't you forget it." I cleaned out my locker. 11 years fit in 1 paper bag, 2 mugs, a stethoscope, a drawing Ellie made me of a bird in a nurse's cap. Driving home, I took the long way, which I never do. The long way happens to pass my parents' street, which I'll admit was not an accident. The house sat there in the winter dark, porch light on, and low along the foundation. Through the window wells glowed the light of the basement, pale yellow even from the road. 2 definitions of a real life, 1 block apart. In one window, a banner made by people who'd watched me work. In the other, a twin bed made by people who'd watched me my whole life and never once seen me. Sunday was 2 days out, and I still didn't know exactly what I'd say at that table. As it turned out, I didn't need a speech. My mother had written one for me. Saturday, I took Ellie to the library, just the 2 of us, a standing date we'd kept since she was 5. Except this time, we did something new. We got her a library card of her own. She signed her name on the little line with her tongue between her teeth, pressing so hard she tore the paper slightly, and the librarian laminated it while she watched, like it was a moon landing. Afterward, we sat at the big table by the atlas stand, and Ellie, who is 7 and sees everything, spun the globe and said, "Show me your favorite place." I placed her finger on Ohio. Then I walked it across the Atlantic slow and set it down on the west coast of Ireland. "That's far," she said. "It is," I said. She looked at the globe for a while, keeping her finger on Galway like she was holding it down for me, saving my seat. Then she looked up with those X-ray eyes and asked, "Will you still know me?" I had to study the atlas stand for a second. Then I told her the truth, which is the only thing I've ever been able to give that kid. Everywhere I go, I said, I will know you, that's a nurse promise. We're not allowed to break those. She nodded, very businesslike, and stamped my hand with the date stamper when the librarian wasn't looking, so I'd have proof. I still have the smudge in a photo. Here's why I'm telling you this. Whatever happened at that table on Sunday, I knew 4 small people were going to hear a version of me afterward that I didn't write. I had one afternoon to leave a truer version behind, sealed and laminated in the one heart most likely to keep it. Sunday, February 8th. I got to my parents at 3, as instructed, and I made the chicken as instructed. And I want to be honest about why. Not obedience ceremony. I stood in the kitchen where I'd been useful my whole life, and I brined and buttered, and roasted that bird for 14 people. And I did it the way you lay flowers somewhere on purpose for the last time, as a free gift rather than a bill paid. The house filled up behind me. Uncle Gary arrived first, as always, and posted up by the football game. Aunt Ruth brought her ambrosia salad that nobody eats and everybody praises. Danny's crew blew in at 5 like a small weather system. Backpacks, sippy cups, Mason narrating, Sam sprinting, Nora on Kayla's hip. Ellie peeling off to find me in the kitchen and show me the library card tucked in its own pocket. My mother orchestrated everything from the head of the table, radiant, wearing her good earrings, the ones that signal an occasion. My father carried in extra chairs, then opened the sparkling cider Danny's crowd doesn't drink, and lined up glasses like little soldiers. 14 plates counting mine. The good china I'd helped move in October, cloth napkins, and then I saw it. At my place, leaned neatly against my water glass, the way a menu waits at a restaurant, sat a bound packet, maybe 20 pages, spiral spine, clear plastic cover. Kayla's font, Clip Art Sons. The cover read, in cheerful purple capitals, Weaver Family CHILDCARE Plan. There was a tab inside with my name on it. I looked at it the way you'd look at your own obituary printed early and placed beside your fork. I did not touch it. I sat down, smiled at Ellie across the table, and felt the phone in my pocket against my hip, patient as a stone. Glasses started filling. Here we go. Dinner rolled along on its tracks. Chicken praised, kids fed. Gary telling his one story about the raccoon. And then, at dessert, my mother stood and dinged her glass with a spoon. The table went quiet the way it always does for her. She'd prepared remarks. God gives every family exactly what it needs, she began, hand on her heart, and she toasted Danny and Kayla and the little blessing due in June. Everyone raised sparkling cider and it was lovely. Truly, I raised my glass too, but she didn't sit down. God also provides the help, she said, gleaming, unfolding it like a homily. Which brings us to the second announcement. She turned to me with her arm extended, presenting me to my own family like a prize behind a curtain. From June, our Hillary will be stepping away from the hospital and moving home. Your father did the basement, wait till you see it. To be this family's full-time nanny. All 5 babies. One loving aunt. She actually got applause. Ruth clapped. Kayla, glowing, reached over and slid the spiral packet closer to my plate and whispered that page 4 had the weekly grid. My father raised his glass toward me proud, hopeful, already toasting. I set mine down. Mom, I said, and I kept it level and pleasant. We've talked about this. I have a career. I have a life. The clapping trailed off. And my mother, still standing, still smiling, still warm as August, tilted her head at me with genuine, bottomless fondness and said it. Oh, sweetheart. You don't have a real life anyway. No husband, no babies, that little apartment. This is us giving you one. Around that table. Listen to me. Nobody flinched. Ruth studied her ambrosia. Gary watched the muted football. My father topped off the nearest glass of cider like a man bailing a boat 1 teaspoon at a time. My whole family sat in perfect, comfortable agreement that my life was a vacant lot they'd finally found a use for. I smiled. I actually smiled because 3 weeks. That's why. And I reached into my pocket for my phone. I unlocked it under the table. One tap, the folder named June. I stood up the way my mother had stood, and I turned the screen outward. And I set the phone down in the middle of that table, face up, between the ambrosia and the chicken carcass. Slow and gentle, like laying down a winning hand you're not even proud of. Before you laminate anything else, I said, you should see this. My contract filled the screen, the header with the hospital crest, Galway. The words neonatal resuscitation training specialist, and my signature already on it, dated 3 weeks back. I swiped once, the boarding confirmation. One way, Columbus to Shannon, March 1st, 21 days from that dinner. Nobody moved, I mean that almost clinically. 14 place settings and not one sound except little Nora, 2 years old, drumming her spoon on the tray, the only honest percussion in the house. Ruth's fork stopped in the ambrosia. Kayla's hand lay flat on the spiral packet like she was taking its pulse. Danny leaned in, read the screen, and went gray. My father looked at my mother, which is what my father does instead of having reactions. So I said the rest, and I kept my voice the way I keep it in a code, low, slow, procedural. I've taken a 2-year post in Ireland, training nurses to save babies like ours. I've signed, I've given up my apartment. Friday was my last shift. I fly in 3 weeks. I looked around the whole frozen table and then at the packet by my plate. The plan you printed has one problem. I was never yours to schedule. The room stayed frozen for 1 more second, maybe 2, and then I watched my mother's face do something I had never seen it do in 34 years. It went from marble to water. Her chin shook. Her eyes filled right there, over the good china, in front of her sister and her grandchildren. And my mother said the one thing in this world I had no armor against. Not a scream. Worse, she said it soft. You would leave this family, she said, barely above the sound of the furnace, over a job. That was the soft thing, and it landed the way soft things do, deep under the ribs. Then the room thawed all at once, and everything piled on top of everything. Kayla burst into tears, real ones, I should say. Exhaustion has a sound, and I know it. She cried, how could you do this to the baby? A baby, I'd like the record to show, who did not yet exist and already outranked me. Danny said nothing. He sat there, working the edge of the tablecloth between 2 fingers, staring at my signature like it was a wreck on the highway. My father took off his glasses, cleaned them on his shirt, and said to no one in particular, Ireland, that's an ocean away. As if the problem were nautical. And my mother cycled through her arsenal in front of me, weapon to weapon, while I stood there and watched it happen, almost in slow motion. First, the little laugh. This is a phase. You'll come home by summer. Then the prosecutor, who applies overseas behind her family's back, who does that? Sneaking around for a year like we're strangers. Then the pulpit, hand flat on the table, charity begins at home. Hillary Ann, it begins at home. I gave her the only thing I had left, which was brevity. It's signed, I said. It's paid, I said. It's done. 3 little flat stones, one at a time, into all that churning water. That's when Uncle Gary, who had not said a full sentence since the raccoon story, muted the football, turned around in his chair and said, Carol, let the girl talk. God bless Gary. Because the next thing my mother tried wasn't louder. It was smarter and it nearly worked. But first, since Gary had bought me the floor, I used it one time for 15 years' worth. I didn't shout and I didn't cry and I did not perform. I just said it plain, like a discharge summary. Since you think I don't have a real life, let me tell you where it went. 4 years of it went to Grandma June. Every evening, every weekend, every ambulance ride, while this family called me once a week to check her progress like a package being tracked. Ruth flinched at that one. She knew. The last 3 went to Danny's kids. The midnight fevers, the pickups, the seizure. The 5 weekends a year I took all 4 so you 2 could remember each other's faces. I did it out of love, and I'd do most of it again. But every single one of you sitting at this table filed it under free. I picked up the spiral packet with my name on the tab and set it back down in front of Kayla, gently. Like returning something borrowed. You listed me at Mason's school without asking. You printed me a schedule in October before a single one of you said the word please. Dad talked to my landlord. Mom told the church. My whole future got planned in this house at this table, and now here's my one question, and I'd like a real answer. I looked around at all of them and I let it be quiet, and then I asked it. In 15 years, did even one of you one time ask me what I wanted? Nothing, the furnace hummed. Nora's spoon had stopped. Ellie was looking from adult face to adult face, doing math no 7-year-old should have to do. That's what I thought, I said. And it came out gentler than I expected, because the silence was sadder than I expected. Family takes care of family. I agree with you, Mom. I've been doing it for 15 years. I just was never included in the family being taken care of. My mother folded her napkin very slowly, pressing each crease. When she looked up, her eyes had changed. The storm was gone. Something patient had replaced it, and it scared me more than the shouting. Hilly, my mother said, not Hillary, Hilly, the little girl name, the one from before everything. And her voice went soft as bathwater. Sit down, baby. Please, I stayed standing, but something inside me leaned toward that voice, which is the honest truth, because I'd been waiting my whole life for it. You're right, she said. And the table gasped in its own quiet way, chairs shifting, Ruth's hand at her throat. We should have asked. We got ahead of ourselves. That's my fault, and I'm saying it in front of everyone. She spread her hands, humble, reasonable, her eyes still shining from before. So let's fix it the right way. 1 year, that's all. Stay 1 year, till the baby's steady on her feet and Kayla's back on hers. Then you go to your Ireland and you go right. Her voice cracked, on purpose or not, I still don't know. You go with our blessing. We'll throw you a proper send-off at the church. Your father will drive you to the airport himself, the whole family waving you off, proud of you. Just don't leave us like this, in anger, with everything broken. Don't you want to leave the right way? And my father, who had not asked me a question since I was a teenager, said quietly into the middle of it, We'll finally do it right. Kiddo, Ruth exhaled like a jury delivering a verdict. I want to be dead honest with you about that moment, because this is the whole story right here, not the phone. Everything I had ever wanted from these people was on that table, wrapped and ribboned. To be asked, to be thanked, to be blessed on my way out the door, waved at, missed. All I had to do was hand them 1 more year of my life, and I could purchase the exact love I'd been working 15 years on credit toward. Every eye on me. Ellie's eyes on me. June's watch ticking on my wrist, 4 minutes behind. The way a whole life gets 4 minutes behind, then a year, then 40. And I stood there and actually felt myself begin to nod. Then I caught it, the flaw in the diamond, the thing my whole body already knew. A blessing you have to buy is not a blessing. It's an invoice with a bow on it.